The situation throughout the world does not look good, but I believe it looks a little brighter than it did a while back, and it will continue to look brighter as the National Guard, both air and ground, are brought into federal service, so that the tyrant or the tyrant who would dominate this country will know that we do mean business.
It sounds like a modern issue, but back in the mid-1930s, Japan was an expanding industrial power with a need for resources that the small island nation could not produce on its own.
An industrial nation that is deprived of raw materials has to get them. They survive on that, their whole economy. And our nation cut them off completely.
After already expanding into Korea and Formosa, Japan conquered all of Manchuria by 1931.
Japan didn't have the raw resources to be able to create some things that they wanted to be able to create. So they needed oil, they needed they needed rubber, they needed scrap metal to be able to build things that they needed to be able to become the superpower that they thought they should be, or at least the international power that they thought they should be. So when they expanded into Korea, they expanded into Indochina, but then they expanded into China itself.
Japan invaded China in 1937, provoking international outrage and demands for them to leave.
They went into China, and that should have been quite an eye-opener for the world, but it wasn't.
They stayed in China. The United States reacted by imposing embargoes on Japan, cutting off all of their oil and their scrap metal and their rubber, which was a big problem for Japan. Japan didn't have the raw materials to be able to do that anymore. So Japan came up with this great idea of, why don't we keep expanding, and we'll see if the United States really does anything else, because we need these raw materials.
Well, after World War I, the armed forces were allowed to deteriorate, so to speak, to a point where we didn't have any defense, basically, or inadequate defense, I guess would be a better way of putting it. But in the 30s, when Hitler started to come into the picture, it should have been obvious, in retrospect, it's obvious that we should have known what was going on, but apparently the powers that be had other ideas, and so we went along our merry way without any preparation. And it didn't start until 1940.
On May 16th, 1940, President Roosevelt asked Congress for the authority to call the National Guard to active service.
We saw no reason for not doing what we did, because the war was fundamentally just.
Out of 18 National Guard Infantry Divisions, the 41st Division was among the first 4 to be inducted into federal service, also known as the Sunset Division, the name signified by their bright red and yellow shoulder insignia.
From my standpoint, I think it's a very, very meaningful and a profound selection of an emblem to symbolize what your unit is. And so I'm very proud of that.
By the summer of 1940, it was considered to be the best Guard division in the country.
It was made up of basically Northwest National Guards, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana.
Many of them were young and barely men, and came from all walks of life, barely the legal age of 18, and some not even that.
When I went back to sign up, the captain said, "How old are you?" And I said, 17. And he said, "Go out and walk around the block and come back when you know how old you are." So I gained a year in that block.
And I was quite sure I wouldn't make it because I had some physical deficiencies at the time. But I was interviewed first by a lieutenant and then by a captain and finally the Major Dodson. And after I finished the interview with him, which was not long, but I asked him, have I been accepted? And he says, if you pass the physical on Sunday, you're in. To myself, I said, I won't pass the physical. I got some bad teeth and stuff. I passed. Next thing I knew, my mail started coming to Private Parish.
With morale high and ready for adventure, their patriotic sense of duty was deeply entrenched.
When I joined the National Guard, well, that was, friends might say, a dream come true. I got to be in the Army.
We were mobilized. We were mobilized at the Armory in Portland, and we spent about 2 weeks there recruiting people, training people, and getting issues of clothing and equipment.
And we spent 10 days preparing to be shipped to Fort Lewis, Grayfield.
After summer training in Fort Lewis, Washington, the Sunset Division went to adjacent Camp Murray on September 16th, expecting to serve 1 year of federal duty for their country.
4 divisions were called to service, federal service, September 16th, 1940, for a 1 year period.
We went into Fort Lewis at Camp Murray, trained for 18 months up there, and practically froze to death because we didn't have the facilities to stay in. We had tents. We built our tents out of wood, crating and so forth that we had our equipment in.
At Camp Murray, Major General George A. White, who had commanded the 41st Division since 1929, led them in training.
He's there and he's ready to go. He's going to lead his troops into battle, and he feels a real connection to his troops, and his men feel a real connection to him too, because he's always been there. He's always been the general. So they go and they start training.
It began at the individual and squad level, where the men learned to solve field problems as squad and platoons, then as companies, regiments, and finally as a division.
February 41, we got our first draftees, a whole group of folks that were great service company members from all over the West, and not the West, Ohio, Wisconsin.
Come early fall, and after already serving for a year, the rumors of active duty being extended finally rang true.
We were supposed to have got out in a year of federal service, but they said we weren't going to get out. We started hearing stories about that. So, you know, the usual thing, we started going around writing Ohio on the backs of trucks and things with chalk. And
over the hill in October. True.
Company commander would talk to us. They say, "Are you really going to want out at the end of the year?" And boy, no, please don't put me out. All of us did. Nobody wanted out. We were just going along with the act.
On November 23rd, Major General White died unexpectedly. This was a shock to the troops and to the state of Oregon.
They've only ever had this one general, and most of their memory that they've been around in the Oregon National Guard, and this guy who's been in charge of them forever, that really looks out for them, that's really a part of who they are, is no longer there.
Regular Army Brigadier General Horace H. Fuller was named as the commander of the 41st, taking them to Australia and to the war beyond. During this time, Germany had control of most of Europe and North Africa. Hitler's tyranny reigned supreme. Concurrently, Japan had less than 1 month's worth of fuel to run the native task force that was to be launched to take over the oil supplies in the Netherlands East Indies. Japan decided in an attack planned by Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto that if they took out the U.S. Pacific Fleet, perhaps they could sue for peace with the United States, retain the land that they had acquired, and put an end to the current embargo.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The United States was pretty laid back and lackadaisical up until that point, but that brought everybody's feelings together.
We're pretty good at rebounding from something like that, so they found out.
Among its objectives, Japan meant to dampen America's morale in going to war. However, the maneuver backfired, as many Americans wanted to strongly fight back. As Yamamoto later said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." On December 8th, just 1 day after the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States Congress voted to declare war on Japan, and President Roosevelt signed the war declaration.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
There was such a multitude of thoughts that went through us. Confusion, excitement, sadness.
I remember I was on guard duty up there at Fort Lewis at the time, and all of a sudden it came up, we were at war. And everybody got their rifles and went to guard duty right away.
Units of the 41st Sunset Division immediately took up defense positions, guarding the coast of Oregon and Washington until the local defense could be established.
And we had guns scattered along the Washington coast and up in Port Angeles and Port Townsend area and in the Puget Sound area. Now the guns were there to take out Japanese subs that might enter into the Puget Sound.
The people over there were concerned that there might be an invasion, and they figured if they saw some soldiers there, that it would, and we had these guns on the back of half-tracks and things, and it looked kind of impressive. It really wasn't much, but it looked kind of impressive to them, and they were all happy.
After we'd been down there for a couple months, we went back to camp to get ready to go overseas.
In February of 1942, the 41st Division was relieved from defending the Pacific Northwest coastline and prepared for departure overseas.
I don't think even when we got on the ship to leave San Francisco that none of us knew what we were getting into.
Each infantry unit moved out in large transport ships at different times.
When they decided to take us overseas, we got on the Matsonia, which is a cruise ship for the Matson line, and We zigzagged all around the ocean. It seemed like it took us about 3 weeks to get there.
Everyone was panicky. The division headquarters, including Fuller, General Fuller, were on our ship. And everyone was scared spitless, if you want to know, about getting sunk.
But they would all arrive in Melbourne, Australia between April and May to begin their unparalleled task. The 41st and 32nd Infantry Divisions were the first American units to arrive in Australia.
We landed in Sydney Harbor as a whole harbor lined with people waving handkerchiefs and cheering, civilians who were scared to death.
Unfortunately, the bulk of the Australian Army was in North Africa and the Middle East, fighting against Germany and Vichy France, and was scrambling to get back in order to defend their home.
All the Australian men were gone. You talk about happy to see us.
And the Americans began to come, and we were so grateful. We'll forever be grateful.
Because they thought that they were going to be next. The Japanese was going to invade there, you know, but we got there just in time to more or less save them.
The 41st Infantry Division traveled by what was a tedious rail system, stopping at every state line to change trains to Rockhampton in Queensland, where they trained for jungle warfare.
We had to get off 3 different trains, 3 different tracks, unload all the trains, put them on another train because it was a different track when we hit another state.
And then we'd go so far, the train would stop, everyone would get off and get on the next gauge. There were different gauges on the railroad. We finally got to Rockhampton.
It had been cold down at Melbourne. It was tropical, semi-tropical in Rockhampton. So
we did very vigorous training in swamps and everything that we would be meeting up in New Guinea.
Rockhampton was where we got our issue of jungle gear.
Some of us had rifles, some of us had Tommy guns. Some of us just automatics. I guess probably we were as well equipped as we could be under the circumstances.
It was here many of the soldiers received a cultural education on the various food rations that were to be provided to them.
Food was terrible. All of us lost maybe 20, 30 pounds.
K rations were not too good, but they kept us alive. For us, the cooks became riflemen or ammunition carriers, and we lived on K rations almost exclusively. And we had hardtack in every meal. Lunch was hardtack and this cheese, and we were nearly always short of water.
We had very little water, very little. But had a mutiny there when the old colonel, who was a West Point graduate, I guess, we were going by, and here he is down there shaving. Nobody had a shave or a drink of water that was any good, and man, that made everyone mad.
We moved 1,300 miles in 100 days, and that is hopping up and down along the coast.
A strategy devised by General MacArthur and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz was called island hopping. Rather than attack each unit of Japanese soldiers, they would attack only the ground needed for more harbors and airfields on the way to liberating the Philippines from the Japanese occupation and to make the final attack on Japan's homeland.
Island hopping, you don't need to take every single island. We can fight the Japanese on this island because they have a good seaport or they have a good airstrip. But this next island over, we can hop over them. We don't need their airstrip. We don't need their seaport. That proves very effective during World War II because you don't have to fight the Japanese on those islands that you skip.
The bypassed Japanese soldiers in the positions that were not attacked were instead cut off from supplies by the U.S. Navy and either surrendered or slowly died of starvation, becoming combat ineffective and saving American lives. It was from Papua New Guinea that Australia feared an attack from Japanese forces. Japan had taken over most of the island of New Guinea, except for a small southeast corner, which contained the strategic Port Moresby.
It was away from WWII, it was away from Finschhafen, it was away from Japanese air. They picked a place that they could land the easiest and they could support logistically.
It was in the Battle of the Coral Sea where the U.S. Navy prevented the Japanese from securing this crucial port.
Even though the Battle of the Coral Sea, we had a lot of U.S. casualties, it was in the long run a strategic victory for the United States because for the first time we stopped Japanese expansion.
This one plane come over the land and come at us. And I started firing, and just as he turned like that is when I must have hit him because he went right over. And I'll never forget, I was jumping up and down. I said, we got him, we got him. And I said, he didn't even shoot at us. And Ray says, look around you. In front of us, around us, there are bullet holes all over the place. I didn't even know he was firing. You know, you're so wrapped up in that.
Because the 32nd Infantry Division was in a more accessible position, it got the initial call to hit the enemy's left flank in the vicinity of Buna.
The 32nd Division was picked even though they had 5 months less training than the 41st, because we were mustered to service in September 40, and they were called to service in February 41. So we did have 4 months or 5 months more of training than they, which would pretty much indicate that that would be the one to send. But strategically and tactically, they were the ones that picked because they were in the place to get taken out fast.
However, the fighting turned brutal, and the 32nd was unprepared for what they would face there.
The immediate impression I had of the 32nd Division were seeing soldiers look like ghosts.
They just got decimated. They did as good as they could do.
They have a lot of casualties, and they actually end up between being killed in action, wounded in action, and diseases that they discover that are in New Guinea. They end up with 100% casualties.
In its first battle of World War II, the 32nd Infantry Division were left with 804 dead and 1,918 wounded. It was decided to commit more American troops to the fight in New Guinea, so the 163rd Infantry Regiment of the 41st Division was flown in to aid the 32nd, which was the first time an entire infantry regiment had done so.
They sent the 163rd because they were closer. We were to follow them. Well, but they went up and they got into when the final push on Buna. They got in on that, and they lost a lot of people. We had to send some people from ours over because they were short-handed when they went up, and we sent some of ours over, and some of the ones we sent over got killed. Eichelberger had decided to just kind of wait them out and starve them out, and that would have worked, but it would take a time, and old MacArthur said nothing to do. So he got everybody together that he could, including the 163rd, and the ones that could move out of the 32nd. They just had a few that were able to move, you know, and got them, and they all attacked at once, and they knocked out Buna and Sanananda at the same time.
In addition, malaria and dengue fever were constant threats to the men. For every 2 men who were wounded or killed in battle, 5 were out of action due to fever,
that was probably the worst thing that happened up there at Buna, was the tremendous amount of casualties from illness.
The people that had malaria had to go to a special place, they called it the Fox Farm. And they had to go there and retrain and exercise and to get rid of that malaria. And you took Atibrin, which turns you yellow anyway. It wasn't a very good deal.
You could tell the veterans from any new guys, just it made your skin yellow and your eyes were kind of yellow too.
Every other guy had malaria. They give us those pills, but they didn't give us enough of them.
Our doctor was famous for asking the visiting surgeon, he said, what is the death rate of those who die of malaria? Try that one. A great roar went up.
The next objective was to capture the Mubu airstrip off the shore of Salamaua, New Guinea. The amphibious assault on nearby Nassau Bay at night was the first amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater and the first for the Sunset Division.
At Nassau Bay, we were able to set up a supply point where we could shell Salamaua and be able to capture the Mubu airstrip.
Salamaua was 162nd Infantry Regiment operation. I think they were in combat, constant contact, no let up.
It met with stiff Japanese resistance, and it took over 3 bloody and tiresome days of fighting on the beach to rout the Japanese defenders. Water and food had to be flown and dropped into the dense mountainous region, while the American soldiers took command of the airstrip.
They'd go around and around the airport where they were going to drop the stuff, and then when they'd get ready, they'd tilt the plane sideways, and here we were on the opposite side of the door, the open door, and the supplies were sitting in front of the door, and we were there with our feet kicking them out. And you could just look right down at the ground.
The 41st had the additional distinction of having a president's son among them. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Roosevelt, the son of President Roosevelt, commanded 3rd Battalion of the 162nd Regiment. He proved to be a very good commander, and a hard-fought-for ridge in the Salamaua battle was named after him. Until then, the 41st had always been tagged with the nickname of the Sunset Division. But press releases spilled out of New Guinea with more and more frequent dispatches, referring to the Northwest group of soldiers as the Jungleers. The new nickname, a reminder of those early days when every bit of fighting in the roughest hellhole jungles brought huge encouragement to the victory-starved American people at home.
It's applied properly, I think. The division as a whole was enmeshed in plenty of combat in jungles.
I'm tangled up with a couple of Japs coming up the hill. I got rid of one of them by poking him with a bayonet, and then I took it at my helmet and I whacked the other one inside the head with it, let out a lot of screeching and yelling, and fell back down the ravine. And so then I took off my helmet and swung it around by the strap and swung it down the hill in case there was any more coming. Because I was out of everything, I didn't have more grenades, and my Tommy gun was laid up on the ground where I dropped it. And when I was coming back on the boat, I heard some guys talking about this guy that was fighting these Japs with his helmet. That was me.
After the fighting in Papua, the 41st were shipped back to Rockhampton to heal, continue to train, and return to full combat strength, with more U.S. soldiers arriving to replenish their outfit.
After Buna, after Sanananda, and after Salamaua, we went back to Australia.
So they sent us back to Australia to kind of recuperate.
We was the first replacements that joined the outfit, that joined the 41st in Rockhampton.
The 41st Infantry Division band serenaded the victorious Jungleers at Oro Bay, and the men thoroughly enjoyed experiencing a touch of home. Their recovery would be short-lived, as their campaign was far from over. In order for General MacArthur to continue his drive to the Philippines, the rest of New Guinea had to be secured. It was now April of 1944, and the regiments of the 41st Division landed in Itapi and Hollandia on the same day. The 163rd Infantry Team landed in Itapi and was virtually unopposed. The Hollandia assault, led by the 186th and the 162nd and assisted by the 218th Field Artillery, occurred against 7,600 poorly armed Japanese who averaged only one rifle for every 10 of their soldiers.
Hollandia was really the first example of the effective strategy of island hopping.
MacArthur had been going up the north coast of New Guinea a step at a time where the Japs had airstrips and so forth.
The Japanese felt that we would have to stop in Wewak on the way. So they sent all of their troops to Wewak to keep the 41st or keep the Americans from progressing farther.
They thought we were going to land there, and it was just garrison troops there at Hollandia, and it was just a piece of cake. We marched down there, no casualties hardly at all, you know.
We were able to get Hollandia quickly. We were able to land on Hollandia and be able to unload our supplies, whereas the Japanese are sitting out at Wewak with 45,000 of their troops waiting for the 41st to come and attack there, and no Americans come to Wewak.
It was a fairly easy fight compared to what we thought it was going to be.
This misstep by the Japanese would prove to be a costly mistake. It was at Hollandia that the Jungleers received yet another nickname, this time from the Japanese propaganda machine of Radio Tokyo.
Tokyo Rose was a Japanese propagandist who gave our division the name the Bloody Butchers.
They wanted to influence their own people more than us, I think. They weren't butchers. I didn't think so.
I have mixed feelings about whether that's good or bad, but it sounds as if we were taking care of business.
Made you feel a little bit stronger, you know.
Hardly had the red dust from Itapi and Hollandia been washed out of the men's hair when the 41st started their 3-week-plus mission into Wakti to seize the airstrip. They were composed of the now reinforced 163rd Infantry Combat Team, with the 167th and 218th Artillery Battalions providing support for the operation.
Wakti was an island, small island, not much bigger than an aircraft carrier, and about 3,000 yards off the New Guinea shore. Our regimental combat team landed on the mainland and engaged in position and started fired all night on Wakti.
Then the 163rd Regiment of the division took it, and they killed 700 and some Japs in 2 days, and we took 4 prisoners. It got down to where the war wasn't like it was in Germany. You could surrender and you're pretty safe. There wasn't no surrendering, it was either or.
That was the first of the caveman wars. They lived not in caves, but in massive cement bunkers and coconut log bunkers. And we did a lot of firing with delayed fuse, trying to blast them out of it, firing almost steadily.
The U.S. destroyed more than 800 Japanese soldiers that were well positioned in order to bring devastating, accurate fire on the attacking U.S. military. But although many were wounded, only 20 from the division were killed.
Then we would run patrols during the day to see if we could find any Japanese organized positions out within 1,500 yards of our perimeter. I took the first one of those down right up the Tor River, and we ran into a couple of Japs. I was laying there, he said, and the machine gun bullets were just drawing a line about 2 feet in front of my nose in the ground. He said, talk about scared. Artillerymen will do anything you want as long as you lead them. So the officer always led the patrol, which was not infantry tactics, and I was leading that one, and we ran into a couple of strays. I think those were the only two I personally killed during the war.
Though not a large-scale operation, WWII embodied all of the ugliness that went into the making of any war and would set the stage for their next bloody assignment. MacArthur's next main objective was to secure the Makmur Airdrome on the island of Biak.
Well, Biak is a little island compared to New Guinea in the Gulf, Geelvink Gulf there.
It's right on the equator.
In the daytime it was 110, and at night it went down to 80, but by right after daylight it'd go right back up again.
And so the sun sets at 6 and gets up at 6. It's very hot.
That whole island was coral. It had been evidently in the bottom of the ocean, and earthquakes lifted it up. It risen up, and it figures only about 200 years old.
And they were covered with growth, you know, trees and things that went right into the coral rock.
About the biggest tree on it was only about that big around.
You couldn't tell it wasn't just a regular island, but if you tried to dig, you knew what happened. It was just coral rock.
They were hard to walk over or climb over or anything else.
The biggest casualties were on the buttocks because you couldn't dig a foxhole.
We were trying to dig a foxhole, but the ground was just like cement and we couldn't dig one.
When you couldn't do it, you'd break your pick. And we just get pieces of rotten coral about so big and line it up around your hole. Then you'd get behind that with your helmet like that, and there you squatted all night long.
And they lay flat on the ground, and that was the part that was sticking straight up. They got injuries.
The seat was out of my pants, and the seat was out of my shorts, and I had scabs all over my ass for sliding down those coral rocks, skinned my butt. And everybody was the same way.
Beginning with the 186th and the 162nd Infantry Regiments, and eventually joined by the 163rd Infantry after the Battle of WWII, the 41st had to rout over 10,000 Japanese soldiers that were entrenched in caves cut into the coral cliffs of the island.
They were in caves up there.
Caves up there, yeah.
And they'd move out and lob some shells out and then go back in.
Those coral caves were big.
Big caves, you know, just like the Oregon caves, kind of back through that coral rock.
They would go back in these caves and fortify them and supply them, and they get pretty elaborate, really.
We knew they were in there and they wouldn't come out.
And that's where the Japanese were holed up. They're the ones that were doing the attacking and stuff.
We had Japanese interpreters that go in there and talk to them, but it didn't do any good.
I imagine they had at least 200-300 in there.
So they'd take a 50-gallon barrel and take it up there and make a hole in it and just let it run in there. And when they got it all done, they'd throw a hand grenade in and that'd blow up the place.
The number of Japanese soldiers was well over the estimated intelligence reports given to them. This turned out to be a critical oversight.
As good as the information was about Hollandia, it was bad about Biak.
MacArthur had the worst guy estimating what was on the next island.
They just didn't read that right at all. And we sailed through Hollandia quickly. In Biak, we had trouble, lots of it.
We thought that Biak was going to be a piece of cake, and boy, was it ever different.
They thought there were about 4,000 Japs there, and there were really about 12,000 there.
And we were outnumbered about 3 to 1, and you never want that in the infantry.
We went in with just 2 regiments.
2 regiments, and 162 got hammered. They were on our left, and man, you talk about a war. They almost cut the battalion off.
And we went up there and jumped on them and landed and immediately found out that there was a lot of people there, you know. And one guy told me, he said, it's about the second or third day we was there, he said, Sarge, I could shoot in any direction and hit a Jap.
But MacArthur was in a sweat to take it because Someplace out in the Pacific, South Pacific area, they wanted an island, and they wanted those airstrips. That's what all this whole war was about, was airstrips over there.
The Japanese devised a new strategy to let soldiers land on the beaches unopposed and then attack from well-defended positions, with their machine guns and artillery carefully aimed on strategically important sites.
They were up on those cliffs. It just looks like there's a big orange coming at you, coming off those cliffs, just like and you're only seeing one. You're not seeing 4 or 5 or 6 of them you don't see. They had guns on tracks. They could pull them in, pull them out. They used them very effectively.
Then they had it all arranged between the Navy and also with the Air Corps to bomb these cliffs that the Japanese had mountain guns in the caves. And so they'd fire back and forth. There we were right in the middle.
There was 2 roads, one this way and one this way, and we set up our perimeter there. And the next morning they attacked us from about 3 different angles.
And they see you first, you see them first. That's all. It's not being ambushed or surprise. It was ordinary tactics. You just go till somebody shoots at you.
They charged it in bayonets, and why they weren't shooting, I don't know. And we had those Giron rifles, you know, and all you do is just bang, 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 bang.
We'd gone around and we went right out onto the airfields. We evidently didn't think that anybody would come around from the back side, and we were around there. I don't think we even fired a shot. Went in, it took over the airfield, you know, and it's hot dog, you know.
The Japs knew we were there because we started getting in aircraft fire from way back in the island.
Next thing we knew, they started shooting at us off of these cliffs with those anti-aircraft guns, you know.
Big cannons.
They weren't too effective, but they could sure scare the heck out of you, you know.
They'd hit the middle of the airfield and
squeak and screech, and then bam!
Sail on out in the ocean, but they'd go over our heads.
They said, well, we're going to root them out of there, and then now that turned into something else, because you had to get up there first, and then if you got up there, how do you find them, you know? And they had a cave up there, and they'd pull these things in, and then they'd push them out and fire them, and then pull them back in the cave.
After about 4 hours, here come 3 B-25s, and they just strafed and bombed that hell out of those guns and silenced them.
Bombs. Very nicely, please. The mission of attacking this ridge directly to our rear, which is about 2380 on the map. B Company is moving through F Company's present position, located on this high ground back there. They're going to pass through F Company and attack up towards the same hill, 2380. Now, can you give me a concentration on that hill?
This also marked the first tank-to-tank battle in the Pacific Theater, where the terrain and conditions permitted the full use of tanks. The difference between the Japanese and U.S. tanks were substantial.
We had 3 Sherman tanks with us, and they went up and had the only tank battle they ever had in the South Pacific was there on the beach.
And it was a mismatch. They're tankettes.
They were little Mickey Mouse looking things.
And we only had Shermans.
They had 75mm guns on them, and those Japs only had 37s.
It was not a 3-inch gun, probably 1.5 or maybe an inch. It wouldn't even penetrate, just bounce off.
And those Shermans would go up and they'd just bam, and they'd blow the turf right off of those things.
Our tanks started firing in with their machine guns because they couldn't shoot the big guns because they're too close. They were so close that they were, they didn't know where they'd go, you know. The cannonballs hit that stuff. They just fought a duel with those things, and I was wondering, well, how long is it going to go on, you know. And I could see those things falling every place, you know. They'd spent bullets plopped down here and there, and they racked up every one of them there. They just blew those Japanese tanks, just blew them all to the dickens. And the last The last tank, the guy jumped out and ran.
The fight for Biak, with its critical airfield, took over 2 months to complete. General MacArthur grew impatient with the slow speed of the operation.
We should never have gone down the road. We should have taken the highland before we tried to take the airstrip. But MacArthur was in a hurry, and he thought the general was being too conservative. He sent Eichelberger in to replace him, General Eichelberger. General Fuller resigned, really. He wasn't fired, he resigned. He thought it was a disgrace that they sent Eichelberger in to take over for him.
I personally didn't care for that. I thought he was maligned unduly. He was asked to do something that he didn't have the tools to do it with.
And our commander of the 163rd Regiment took over eventually when Eichelberger left.
General Eichelberger looks for a new commander of 41st Infantry Division and calls General Jens Doe from his command of the 163rd Regiment of 41st Infantry Division to take over as the new commander of the 41st Infantry Division. The men of the 163rd have great respect for this commander that has led them successfully in many battles up until this point. And the men of 41st Infantry Division find out that he is really a very good battlefield commander.
Biak would be the longest and bloodiest battle that the 41st would fight, with over 2,800 soldiers getting killed or wounded. Major James S. Morris of the 162nd Infantry's 3rd Battalion spoke afterward. A soldier's life, especially in time of war, is a hard one. Ours is a dangerous profession. Those dangers are accepted without question by the soldier, and he follows through on his job with little thought for his personal sacrifices, which must necessarily be taken for granted. Men fall on the field, never to rise again. And upon their passing, we dare not pause or dwell. There is still a war to be won and a job to be done. Although the U.S. had seized primary control, New Guinea would not be fully secured until the surrender of the Japanese Empire, which would come soon. At the end of the conflict, over 30,000 Japanese soldiers would surrender on New Guinea alone, something they were not accustomed to doing during the war.
Japanese ages don't surrender. He was a good little soldier, but he'd stay there till he died.
Their Bushido, their code, they'd rather die than say they surrendered, and that's what they did.
They would rather do away with themselves than to be captured.
Saddest thing, because all they had to do, that was the guys out of the caves, and all they had to do is come out there with a flag the next morning, just wait till the next morning, wave that, and they'd have been taken prisoners, and their wounded would have been taken care of, and fed them and clothed them.
Now, when we get them, maybe that they will have gone for a long time without water, perhaps without food. All right, give them a drink of water if you like. Give them something to eat if you like. But don't give them cigarettes. Don't give them gum. Don't give them candy, if you have any. Treat them according to the rules of war, no less and no more.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
Making good on his pledge, I shall return, General MacArthur positioned the U.S. forces to make an assault on the Philippine Islands. Everyone, including the Japanese, knew this would happen. But the secrecy and veracity with which he made his return came as a devastating surprise.
General MacArthur, at the very beginning of World War II, actually was evacuated from the Philippines. And when he left, he said, I shall return. So now 41st Division is part of the group that General MacArthur is commanding, and they are returning to the Philippines.
On February 28, 1945, the Jungleers were called in to mop up and invaded Palawan Island to cut the Japanese route of retreat to Borneo. It was on Palawan that the Japanese forced 150 Allied prisoners of war into an air raid shelter. and burned the men alive. A handful of these POWs escaped to bring this information back to the U.S. forces. Fighting went on until March 30th, when the 186th Infantry departed, leaving the Philippine Guerrilla Army to clear out the few remaining Japanese invaders. During this time, the rest of the 41st units, primarily the 162nd and 163rd Infantries, were ordered to fight at Zamboanga, where they were later joined by the 186th, with their main objective being the seizure of the beachhead adjacent to Wolf Airstrip. To better mobilize the troops, water transport crafts called landing ship tanks, or LSTs, were built specifically for this purpose. Made specifically for World War II, these LSTs carried significant quantities of vehicles, cargo, and landing troops directly onto the difficult shores.
We call them buffaloes and alligators. And one, the only difference in them is one let the people out the front, the other let the people out the back. And the other one, it was just the opposite. It was hinges at the back and the opening was up front.
Had a big well down the center, and they'd flood the well so that alligators or track amphibians could float in there, and then we loaded up in there when it got up next to the landing point, and they'd drop the gate and flood it again, and we could just chug right out.
The Japanese were no match for the heavily fortified U.S. forces. Zamboanga was termed the perfect amphibious operation, of which the only major tragedy at this time was the startling news the soldiers would hear from home: the sudden death of President Roosevelt.
I think Roosevelt was much admired and much regret and sadness when he died.
Meanwhile, the Jungleers were finally out of the hot jungles of New Guinea and were taking a little time to enjoy the comparative ease and paradise on the beaches of Zamboanga. The soldiers feasted on the native fruits and vegetables and engaged with the islanders, who were thankful for their protection.
They finally decided that we were American soldiers, not Japanese, so they welcomed us into the camp, and they threw things on the fire and warmed things up for us. They cooked some meat.
They deep-fried bananas. That's the first time I'd ever had anything like that. And it was pretty good, really. And we drank some of their tuba, something they do up in the coconut palms. They gather this stuff up, and it's intoxicating. And so we had an opportunity to sample that.
After the Philippines were secured, Allied forces began to build up for the push into Japan. The 41st Division was part of Operation Coronet and was scheduled to be one of the first units to land on the nearby island of Kyushu.
There was a big thing on the wall, and I pulled it back, and here was a map of Japan. And it showed that we were going to land in Kyushu on the eastern shore with a Marine Division on our left and 3 other divisions on the other side. Boy, I didn't want to do that. I really didn't.
And if that had taken place, that would have been a hellhole, because they would have been fighting everybody from one end of it to the other.
We were left at Okinawa, and we were going to go in, and those Japs, as fanatic as they were, they'd been fighting us with pitchforks or baseball bats or anything. We'd had to kill the whole nation in order to whip them.
However, unknown to most Americans at the time, theoretical physicists were secretly working on a new superweapon called the atom bomb.
The atomic bomb was an idea that was actually brought over from Europe, from some German physicists came over and actually escaped from Germany, came over to the United States and brought their knowledge with them. So they set up some testing facilities in the United States, in Tennessee and Washington and New Mexico, where they tested various physicist theories about how the atomic bomb should work. It now falls on President Truman to say, let's use the atomic bomb and be able to stop this war before it goes on any farther. The war in Europe had already ended, and we weren't fighting in Europe anymore. And so we had this ability to be able to use this very destructive weapon.
After the bomb was successfully tested in New Mexico on July 16th, the two remaining superweapons, nicknamed Fat Man and Little Boy, were shipped to the island of Tinian, where B-29 Super Fortress aircraft were stationed at the ready. On August 6, 1945, Japan's city of Hiroshima was annihilated.
The United States asked the Japanese if they will then surrender. The Japanese decline, and the second atomic bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki.
Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war. Only a Japanese surrender will stop us. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies, and we pray that He may guide us to use it in His ways and for His purposes.
Nagasaki was subsequently bombed 3 days later, and the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria.
I don't fault Harry Truman for that at all. He was the right man in the right place for that one. He had the stuff to say, we're going.
And if we'd have gone into Japan, who knows how long I'd have been there. I really don't think I'd have made it through, but I think Truman saved my life.
Well, I think it saved many lots of lives. We'd had to go into Japan, we'd had to kill everybody we could run across.
And he saved the lives of millions of Japanese, and certainly a lot of us, because we were going in the first day.
It was a blessing that had to kill so many people to save so many lives afterward.
You wouldn't want anybody to have to go through it, but you got to look back on what we had put up with. I don't mean we as so, I mean the nation as a whole. And we certainly didn't ask for any of that.
It was terrible that all those innocent people got killed, but that's war, you know. Look at people over there in Europe, innocent people that got killed and stuff. But that's war, that everybody is involved in war.
Japan finally agreed to the surrender terms.
After the second bomb dropped, the emperor said that's it. He said to come in to throw in the towel.
And the conclusive surrender paperwork on the USS Missouri was signed on September 2nd.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
World War II had come to an end.
For the first time, the Japanese people hear their emperor's voice on the radio telling them that he is surrendering and that the war is over. Now the 41st can go into Japan as conquerors rather than going in and trying to fight their way onto the Japanese beaches. The Japanese handle this very well. The Japanese are very good about following what their emperor says, and so they surrender, and when they surrender, they do surrender fully and completely.
The occupation of Japan was really unbelievable to me.
They treated us real nice after we was there a couple of days. We were up there, we helped a lot of people, a lot of children, women. We helped them with a lot of food and stuff.
Each street we came to had Japanese policemen in blue uniforms with their backs to us, looking the other way, which we learned later was a sound of honor.
They treated us really nice after they got to know us.
Streets were deserted. Most of the buildings had windows boarded up for bombing reasons, of course.
It was just like people at home that got caught up in a war and didn't know what to do with it. And that's what they were taught.
It was so quiet, and we were marching through it. It was just unbelievable that we were taking the place after all that terrible fighting. We were going in, and it was nothing to it.
The whole village was nice to us when we went in there. There wasn't no spitting or spatting. They was just nice people. And we tried to help them out the best we could, like we always do.
In what would be the happiest of New Year's, the 41st Infantry Division was officially deactivated on December 31st, 1945, and the soldiers returned home to their families to begin their new lives of hope and freedom.
We landed, and at Fort Lawton, they had a bunch of German POWs doing the cooking. And they asked you, what do you want? You know, and I said, well, what do you got? And they said, we got anything you want. I said, I want a nice steak with milk and everything I hadn't had. Boy, did I get sick.
The 41st could now look back on the war with honor and dignity, gratified in having been victorious, satisfied in fighting a war it believed in.
It was beautiful. They did everything a soldier is supposed to do, plus a lot more, and they never stopped to ask how or why.
We didn't worry about any medals or anything.
But I was no hero. I know what a hero is, and I wasn't one.
The 41st didn't get the credit that it should have.
If anything, we should all have got a medal.
The 41st Division was the first division that went overseas. They were over there the longest, 42 months. They fought in more battles than any other division. Being that we had that training that we did before was instrumental in our attitude, and our training taught us that we had a job to do and we had to get it done.
The war in the Pacific had tested the resolve of the Sunset Division, and in what was one of the more critical moments in U.S. history, the bravery and ultimate sacrifice of these Jungleers will live on in the hearts of America and in the world forever.